You know, one of the weirdest things about Japanese, when you really think about it, is how one kanji can have multiple readings. When we're students, we're told that we just have to swallow it and deal with it. But I thought I would take a moment and explain how this happened historically. I've been talking so far a little bit about onyomi and kunyomi, and that's what this lesson is all about. What are onyomi, what are kunyomi, and how did they come about? Originally, kanji came to Japan through the Korean peninsula sometime before the 5th century AD. At that time, kanji were used not just for their reading, for their pronunciation, but also for writing in kanbun, in classical Chinese. However, kanji also corresponded to concepts for which there was already an indigenous Japanese word. And thus, kanji became the writing system for Japanese as well as Chinese. I know I'm simplifying things to some extent, but we'll get down into the weeds very quickly. Okay, onyomi and kunyomi. As you know, because we've already been looking at Nelson's dictionary, most kanji have two types of readings, onyomi and kunyomi. Not all kanji have both, as we'll see, but the vast majority of kanji have at least one onyomi and one kunyomi. What are these things? The onyomi is derived from the pronunciation of the character when it was brought over from China long ago, in theory. And there's a much bigger story there that we'll get to in just a minute. Sometimes the onyomi is called the sinicized reading or the Chinese reading of a character. I prefer to call it onyomi, to use the Japanese term, just to keep things straightforward. We don't have to deal with different translations. The kunyomi is the indigenous Japanese reading for the concept that the character represents. So, for example, the kanji here has two readings. It can be read sui. Sui is the onyomi of that character, and usually onyomi are given in dictionaries, Japanese dictionaries, with katakana. And the kunyomi is mizu. Generally speaking, as I said, onyomi is represented by katakana, kunyomi is represented by hiragana. But if you were glossing a compound, for example, that uses its onyomi for both characters, you would gloss that using hiragana. So this idea of katakana for onyomi really only applies to dictionaries. There are some characters, such as this one, cha, this one, kiku, this one, zo, that didn't exist in ancient Japan. And so if you look those characters up in your Nelsons, you'll find that they only have an onyomi. So the only reading for this character is cha, and that's considered an onyomi. It's not a kunyomi. So here's some examples of kanji on the left. Ten means a point, and its onyomi is 10. A lot of times people think of this character's kunyomi being 10, but technically 10 is not a kunyomi, it is an onyomi. We tend to use that word 10 as we would a kunyomi reading, but it isn't. Likewise, stomach, e, only has an onyomi. Flesh only has an onyomi, as do all of these particular examples. Kokuji are characters that were created in Japan, and therefore they only have a kunyomi. When you look up a kokuji in Nelson's dictionary, for example, it will tell you. It'll have these, it'll either say kokuji in romanization, or it will have these particular characters if you're looking in a Japanese dictionary. So let me give you some examples. Toge, this means a mountain pass, is not used in China. You can't find it in a Chinese dictionary. It's only used in Japan. Hatake, field. Komu, to go into, are characters, likewise, that were created in Japan and therefore they only have a Kun Yomi. I'm not really sure what the history is behind all that, the etymology behind each word. When you look at something like hatake, you think surely that concept was used and written in China at some point in its history before the characters even got to Japan, but perhaps it was written differently, and for reasons I don't know, when the Japanese came to writing down that concept, they decided to create a new kanji. So as I was saying, these characters are classified as national characters, kokuji, and are indicated as such in most dictionaries. One exception to the rule is this particular character, hataraku. It is a kokuji, but it also has an onyomi, go figure. The onyomi was a reading borrowed from the onyomi of a really similar character, this one, do jidosha. Think back to the first video in this unit in which we looked at different kinds of characters and how one part of a character, the onyomi of one part of a character, can be transferred to another character, as we see here. And that's what's happening in this case. Okay, so before we get into the details of the onyomi and the kunyomi, let me just review quickly what I said a few slides ago. The kunyomi is the reading of a kanji that is representative of the word that the Japanese were using for that concept before the Chinese ever showed up. Let me go back a couple slides. We'll look at mizu. Surely the Japanese, we know, had water, used water, talked about water long before the Chinese ever showed up on their shores. They called that thing mizu. Then the Chinese show up on their shores, and the Chinese don't call it mizu. It's the same thing, it's water. But of course the Chinese have their own word for it. And over time, however they were pronouncing it centuries and centuries ago, today an approximation, a Japanese approximation of how the Chinese were pronouncing that thing, water, is sui, is the onyomi. But that begs the question of why are there sometimes more than one onyomi? So let's go forward a little bit and talk about types of onyomi. Although the kanji were brought over from China, as I said, they were not brought over all at the same time. It happened over time. It was a long process. Moreover, they were brought over from different regions within China in those different time periods. So you think of it as almost like a care package of language. It comes over to Japan, and then maybe a century later, another care package comes over. What do I mean by care package? Really what I mean is scholars, visitors, who would bring language and texts and information from the mainland to the Japanese archipelago. So the onyomi of kanji in Japan are thus a disparate group of readings, and they're just as disparate as the time periods and the regions of China. If you know anything about China, of course, dialects in China vary dramatically. The way that language is spoken in the north differs from the central areas, it differs from the south. And so if you're bringing scholars and information over from those different areas at different times, you can imagine how the pronunciation, the Chinese pronunciation of various characters would differ. And of course, to add insult to injury, if you will, Chinese is a much more sound-rich language than Japanese. Japanese is fairly limited in the number of phonemes that it has, and so the Japanese were listening to various Chinese pronunciations of characters and coming up with a near approximation, but certainly not the identical pronunciation that the Chinese were using. So what are the different types of onyomi? There's go-on, also known as the Wu Dynasty pronunciation, kan-on, also known as the Han Dynasty pronunciation. That's the most common one, as you'll see. And there's to-on, also known as the Chinese or mistakenly the Tang Dynasty pronunciation. It really isn't Tang Dynasty here. To just means Chinese. All of these onyomi are based on the Chinese pronunciation of the kanji at some point in Chinese history, at some place in Chinese geography. But sometimes, of course, the pronunciation can change dramatically in order to conform to that really limited Japanese phonetic system. Go-on, it is the oldest group here of types of on reading. It's not clear when kanji were imported to Japan, but the process, we think, probably began sometime around the last half of the 4th century. Kanji readings, which were imported from that time until the 6th century, and that's really early Japanese history, fall into the category of go-on. This was the northern and southern dynasties period in China, and the cultural center of the country was the region around the Yangtze River, where the people of Wu lived. Thus, their southern Wu style pronunciation of the kanji was that which was imported to Japan. And of course, as I mentioned, the Japanese took that go-on and came up with their nearest approximation, whatever they could do with what language they had, to create the initial onyomi. The next category, chronologically, and this is the largest category of onyomi, is kan-on. In the following 3 centuries after that initial importation of kanji, exchange between China and Japan increased. The capital moved. It moved to Chang'an, which is modern-day Xi'an in the north, not the center of the country anymore. And so the northern pronunciation of the kanji were then imported to Japan in that second linguistic care package, if you will. This pronunciation was viewed in Japan as the more correct or the proper pronunciation at the time and was used for Confucian terms. Confucianism was imported into Japan during this time. Also historical terms, poetic terms, etc. The vast majority of the onyomi that we use today and we see in dictionaries are kan-on readings. I should also say that most dictionaries don't give us that breakdown. Nelson certainly doesn't. Not even Morohashi does. There are a few dictionaries that do. Certainly, I would never ask you on a test or a quiz or even a homework what a particular onyomi, what category a particular onyomi falls into. But I think understanding this historical progression is useful for students of Japanese, and that's why this lesson exists. The last category are the to-on, and those are readings that were imported much later. During the Kamakura and Muromachi periods, in case you can't remember, that's 1185 to 1573-ish. We'll talk more about periods later on this semester. Both Zen Buddhism and commerce grew in Japan, and the onyomi imported during that period are called to-on. They're also sometimes called so-on, referring to the Sung dynasty. The Sung pronunciation was closer to the modern Chinese pronunciation, and consequently the to-on is usually close to the present Chinese or the Mandarin pronunciation. Contrary to popular belief, the to of to does not refer to the Tang dynasty, as I said earlier, but rather it refers to China as a whole. So actually, Buddhist words tend to use this to-on reading because this is when Zen Buddhism was largely imported into Japan. So here are some examples of different onyomi, and this is a kind of almost artificial chart. It isn't, there's nothing false here, but I should say that it's really difficult to find kanji that have all three to and han and go readings. Here I have 5 kanji, and I hope all of them are familiar to at least advanced students of Japanese. These, even in intermediate Japanese, are characters that you're likely to have seen, if not already memorized. However, all of the onyomi may not be familiar. You may only know one of these onyomi, but I promise you, if you look these characters up in your Nelsons, you'll find all of these readings. And of course, in addition to the onyomi readings, there's also the Kun Yomi readings. So this character can be read wa, that's its go-on. It can be read ka, that's kind of unusual, but it happens. And it can also be read o. This character can be read gyo, or ko, or an. This character can be read kyo, Tokyo no kyo, It can be read K, and it can be read kin. This one, atama, can be read z or to or ju. For example, manju, a kind of bun, a kind of food. This character can be read myo or me or min. It kind of goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, that just because an onyomi changes doesn't mean that the meaning of the character itself changes. Just like there's a kunyomi and an onyomi, but ultimately in most cases they refer to the similar, if not exactly the same, concept. So that's the history of onyomi and why we have many different kinds of it.